Italy. Today, tourists call it the Mediterranean paradise. Golden sunlight, rolling vineyards, rivers the color of deep jade, church bells resonating over ancient stone streets. Everything about it seems too beautiful, too gentle, too alive to have anything to do with war. But for the Canadian soldiers of 1943, Italy was no postcard. It was a vertical battlefield, a wall of rock stretching for thousands of kilometers, a three-dimensional war zone where every step could be the last. And for a young soldier named Farley Mowat, Italy was more than a campaign. It was fear in its purest form, exhaustion sharpened into despair, a landscape that swallowed entire battalions. He called it simply a vertical battlefield. In his memory, Italy had no seasons, only the scorching furnace of Sicily, the bone-chilling wind of Ortona, the cold, relentless rain of the Liris Valley, and the death-soaked fog of the Gothic Line. In each place, this beautiful country revealed a darker face, cold, merciless, and brutally indifferent. A place so unforgiving that even hardened veterans muttered the same sentence repeatedly: "God, what a country to fight a war in." The moment Canadian troops set foot on Sicily, they realized something no one back home understood. Italy was not a sideshow, not a secondary front, not an easy campaign designed to relieve pressure on the forthcoming Normandy invasion. Italy was a meat grinder, a battlefield where every valley was a trap, every ridge a knife pressed against the throat, every village a fortress carved by desperate yet lethal German defenders. Mowat remembered nights shivering with malaria where the swarm of mosquitoes haunted him like the hiss of a sniper's bullet. Days crawling up jagged slopes under a 45 degrees Celsius sun. Mornings when a single burst from a hidden MG-42 erased a comrade forever. Allied planes may have ruled the skies. Allied ships may have ruled the seas. But the Germans ruled the heights. And to take them, Canadian soldiers had to crawl across the ground like hunted creatures. And that was only the beginning. What came after Sicily, Ortona, the Liris Valley, the Gothic Line, was far worse, experiences Canadians never wanted to speak of again, but which Farley Mowat recorded so history would not forget. For the Canadians in 1943, the real shock of Italy wasn't the enemy. It was the country itself. The map sent to Ottawa showed gentle contours, rolling hills, and charming farm villages. Reality was nothing like that. Italy was a country built vertically, mountains stacked on mountains, ridges carved like knife edges, valleys so narrow that even sunlight struggled to get in. The enemy was everywhere. Cover was nowhere. Farley Mowat once wrote, "Italy was a battlefield designed by a lunatic with a ruler and a knife." And he wasn't exaggerating. A vertical landscape with no safe ground. Canadian infantry quickly learned that almost every battle in Italy began the same way, at the bottom of a hill. And every German machine gun nest was inevitably at the top. The Germans, particularly the paratroopers and mountain troops, were experts at exploiting elevation. A single MG-42 positioned on a high ridge could halt an entire battalion's advance, mortar fire rained down from angles no one had trained for. Artillery observers had perfect views of every movement. It wasn't uncommon for Canadian units to climb 300 to 600 m in a single attack, often under fire. Carrying a 30 kilograms pack, a rifle, webbing, extra ammunition, a shovel, 2 or 3 grenades. By the time they reached the halfway point, they were already exhausted, and the Germans hadn't even begun firing in earnest yet. Mo described these climbs as a slow motion. Suicide, one foot after another. The weather, an enemy without a flag. Whatever the season, Italy offered only misery. Sicilian heat. Temperatures soared past 45 degrees Celsius. Water trucks could not reach the front. Soldiers sucked moisture from grapes they picked by hand. Some collapsed from heat stroke before firing a shot. Winter in the E9s. Ortona's cold was a damp bone-cutting misery. Great coats were soaked for days. Mud swallowed boots whole. Rifle bolts froze overnight. Men shivered so hard they could barely pull a trigger. Spring rains in the Liris Valley. Rivers overflowed. Bridges washed away. Artillery shells landed in mud and failed to explode, only to detonate hours later when a soldier stepped on them. Weather didn't just make fighting harder. It destroyed morale, destroyed equipment, destroyed the human body. Piece by piece. Disease. Malaria was the real sniper. In Sicily, malaria tore through entire battalions. In the winter months, dysentery and trench fever spread like wildfire. Nearly 30% of some Canadian units were sick at any given time. Soldiers fought while shaking with chills, vomiting into ditches, or burning with fever. Some hallucinated during night patrols. Others collapsed on the climb toward German positions. Mo noted bitterly, "We were fighting with half an army. The rest was in the medical tents." The poverty of civilian Italy. Perhaps the most shocking sight for Canadian troops was not the war. It was the people living inside it. Southern Italy in 1943 was desperately poor. Many families had lost everything. Children ran barefoot among rubble. Women begged for scraps. Old men offered to shine boots just for a piece of biscuit. Canadian rations weren't generous, but many soldiers secretly shared theirs anyway, even while starving themselves. These encounters haunted them more than the gunfire. Before a single German paratrooper fired a shot, Italy had already taken its toll. The landscape punished the body. The weather punished the spirit. Disease punished the will. And the suffering of civilians punished the heart. Only after surviving these did Canadian soldiers begin to face the true horror awaiting them next, the city of Ortona. Sicily was supposed to be the easy part. That was the rumor whispered among the Allied ranks in 1943. A soft underbelly, a quick victory, a warm-up act before the real war. For the Canadians who stepped off the landing craft on July 10, 1943, that myth evaporated within hours. Sicily was not soft. It was not gentle. It was not welcoming. It was a furnace, a stone labyrinth, a killing ground carved by nature long before the Germans arrived. Farley Mowat recalled that the first breath he took on Sicilian soil was like inhaling the inside of an oven. The heat hit them like a hammer. The air shimmered above the rocks. Water evaporated faster than they could drink. Within the first 24 hours, Mo watched several men collapse simply from dehydration. A landing into fire and heat. Operation Husky was one of the largest amphibious invasions of the war. But for the Canadians, the initial landing near Pacino was only the beginning. The heat was worse than the gunfire. Soldiers marched under a punishing sun with wool uniforms, steel helmets, overloaded packs, rifles hot enough to burn skin. Their water ration, 1 canteen per day. Often less. Many units resorted to picking unripe fruit from orchards, simply to moisten their mouths. A few drank from stagnant pools and paid the price in the sick bay days later. The first enemy in Sicily was not the vermict. It was the sun. The climb toward the hill towns. Sicily is an island of mountains, cliffs, and perched stone towns that look beautiful in postcards, but deadly in war. The Canadians soon found themselves climbing endless ridges under rifle and machine gun fire. Every town seemed built on top of the sky. Every German position was uphill. Every assault felt like dragging one's body through molten air. At Leon Forte, German paratroopers turned the town into a maze of sniper positions and booby traps. Canadian infantry fought house to house, pushed through narrow alleys while grenades bounced off stone walls. At Acero, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment pulled off one of the most legendary climbs of the campaign. They scaled a vertical cliff at night, carrying full gear just to surprise the Germans at dawn. Mo later said that no one should have survived that climb, but they did. And they paid for it with exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Delay and bleed. The German defense strategy. The Germans knew they could not win in Sicily. Their mission was simpler. Delay the Allies. Make them bleed. Buy time. For the defense of mainland Italy. They fought from stone terraces, reverse slopes, abandoned farmhouses, and hilltop churches. Their retreat was slow, methodical, and deadly. Every valley held machine guns. Every ridge hid mortars. Every bend in the road was a potential ambush. Canadian units often fought an entire day to advance only a few hundred meters. Progress, MO wrote, was measured in bodies, not distance. Civilians in the crossfire. Sicily's civilians were everywhere. Watching from destroyed balconies, running barefoot across fields, hiding in wine cellars. Canadian soldiers were shocked by the poverty. Children begging for scraps. Mothers carrying infants through artillery zones, elderly men guiding herds past advancing tanks. The emotional strain was immense. Soldiers wanted to help, but they barely had enough water for themselves. War had stripped Sicily to the bone, and the Canadians saw every exposed rib. Sicily's final lesson. By mid-August, the island finally fell. The Canadian advance was victorious on paper. But among the men, the feeling was far more subdued. Sicily hadn't broken them, but it had reshaped them. It burned away the last traces of innocence. It hardened their instincts. It taught them what the Italian front truly was. A place where nature, disease, and exhaustion killed almost as relentlessly as the enemy. And as the Canadians boarded landing craft for the mainland, MO wrote one sentence that every veteran later agreed with. Sicily didn't prepare us for Italy. It warned us. By December 1943, the Canadians had already seen Sicily's heat, the mountain passes of Calabria, and the bone-crushing misery of the Adriatic coast. But nothing prepared them for Ortona. Farley, Missouri called it a city that ate men alive. Veterans later described it as a place where the air itself felt hostile. Newspapers would eventually nickname it Little Stalingrad. To the Canadians who fought there, the title was not an exaggeration. If anything, it was too mild. Into the ruins of a dead city. Ortona was a seaside town of narrow medieval streets. Stone houses stacked like dominoes, and walls several feet thick. When the Canadians arrived, much of it was already shattered by weeks of Allied bombing. But ruins don't make things easier. They make them worse. Every pile of rubble became a fortress. Every collapsed building became a sniper nest. Every alley became a canyon of death. Inside this maze waited the German 1st Parachute Division, some of the most disciplined, deadly fighters in the Nazi army. They had vowed to hold Ortona to the last man. And they meant it. MO described the first steps into the city as walking into the mouth of a beast. The first kill zone. The battle began. The moment Canadian boots touched the outskirts. A single German machine gun team opened fire down a tight street, pinning an entire platoon. Mortars fell like stones dropped from the sky. Snipers fired from windows, blown open by bombs. In Ortona, the enemy was not just ahead of you. It was above you, below you, behind you, beside you. Canadian veterans recalled hearing footsteps echo through the rubble, but never seeing who made them. The Germans moved through tunnels, blasted holes in floors, hopped across attics, or crawled through cellars. It was a three-dimensional battlefield, a dark echoing labyrinth. Mouse hauling. The Canadian solution. Walking through the streets was suicide. The Germans had every lane zeroed with MG-42s. So the Canadians invented a brutal tactic, mouse holing. They blasted holes through the walls of buildings, then fought room to room, house to house, bursting into living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, places where families had lived only weeks earlier. Imagine this scene. Walls exploding into dust. Furniture splintering under rifle fire. Floors collapsing. Men choking on plaster and smoke. Shadows moving behind. Broken door frames. Grenade flashes lighting up children's toys buried under debris. That was Ortona. Mo wrote that every room felt like a coin toss between life and oblivion. And the Canadians did it again and again. 4 blocks at a time. German booby traps. The devils. Architecture. The German paratroopers were masters of turning ruined buildings into killing machines. They wired whole staircases with explosives. They planted mines under beds. They hung grenades behind loose doors. They placed trip wires in dark hallways. The worst were the collapsing houses, entire structures rigged with tons of explosives. A platoon could enter a building, take cover inside, and then boom! Nothing left but dust and screams. Canadian soldiers learned to fear quiet houses more than loud ones. Street combat in hell. Every advance cost blood. Every meter gained was paid with bodies. In some sectors, Canadians fought 24 hours straight, too exhausted to think or speak. Some didn't even notice they'd been wounded until hours later. Others were found asleep between blasts, leaning against the ruins of a fireplace with their rifles still in their hands. The smell was indescribable. Gunpowder, concrete dust, burning wood. Cordite, sewage from shattered pipes, and always the smell of death beneath the rubble. Mo wrote, Ortona was a place where even the air tasted wrong. Christmas in a City of Ghosts. December 25, 1943. Christmas. Back in camp, the Canadian commanders had arranged a Christmas dinner. A proper meal with turkey, stuffing, and pudding. Truckloads of food were driven to the front. But the front was Ortona. So the Canadians ate Christmas dinner under fire. Some crouched in shattered doorways, balancing plates on their knees as artillery shook the walls. Others ate beside the bodies of friends who could not be evacuated in time. Some shared food with Italian civilians hiding in basement. A few kilometers away, the chaplain read prayers as shells fell. No hymns, no carols, just the hollow thump of mortars across empty streets. Veterans later said it was the strangest Christmas of their lives, one they never forgot and never celebrated the same way again. The price of victory. The battle raged for 8 days. 8 days of crawling, blasting, bleeding, and dying inside a stone maze. But on December 28, the Germans slipped away under cover of night. Ortona was finally Canadian. The cost over 300 Canadian casualties in a town barely a kilometer wide. Whole companies shredded. Platoon reduced from 30 men to 8 or 9. When dawn came, the Canadians walked the silent streets and realized something unsettling. They had not taken Ortona. Ortona had taken them. Mo summed it up with one of the most haunting lines he ever wrote. Ortona took something from all of us and never gave it back. If Sicily had been a furnace and Ortona a stone labyrinth of death, then the WWII Valley was something else entirely. A swamp of misery, a killing field drowned in mud, and a barrage corridor where the Germans turned every meter of terrain into a calculated mathematical trap. For the Canadians, the valley was supposed to be the gateway to Rome. Instead, it became one of the most exhausting, soul-grinding phases of the entire Italian campaign. A valley that tried to swallow men whole. The WWII Valley should have been simple. Terrain: flat farmable land between the mountains. But months of constant rain had turned it into a wasteland, mud up to the knees, puddles deep enough to hide mines, roads dissolved into sludge, fields churned by artillery into black soup. Every step felt like fighting the earth itself. Canadian soldiers described sinking so deep that they had to pull each other out by the webbing. Rifles jammed with muck. Boots filled with cold water that never dried. The mud swallowed shovels, rations, even helmets if dropped for a second. As one veteran said, the valley didn't want us there. It tried to drag us down. The sound of German artillery in the valley. The WWII Valley funneled everything. Men, tanks, trucks into predictable routes. The Germans knew this, and they zeroed every approach with artillery. 88mm shells screamed across the valley like banshees. Mortars slammed into the mud with a heavy, wet thud. Canadian troops quickly learned that lying flat offered little protection. The mud didn't stop shrapnel. Sometimes mines buried in the swamp detonated hours after a shell landed. Soldiers stepping through reeds triggered delayed explosions left over from the night before. It was a battlefield where death arrived slowly, then suddenly. Supply lines that broke underwater and wait. Nothing worked properly in the WWII Valley. Trucks bogged down halfway to the front. Ammunition crates fell apart when wet. Food spoiled in the rain. Radios malfunctioned. Horses drowned in the mud. Stretchers slipped from rescuers' hands as they carried the wounded. Canadian artillery crews fought not just the Germans, but the swamp. Gunners wiped mud from fuses with their sleeves. Rounds misfired. Gun carriages sank overnight, needing entire crews to lift them out. Every effort took twice the strength and 3 times the time. Moat's memories, the human cost. Farley Matt never forgot the WWII Valley, not because of a single dramatic moment, but because the valley was a slow death, a grinding machine that never stopped. He wrote of men shivering uncontrollably after days without dry clothing, of wounded soldiers lying on stretchers, faces splattered with mud, asking if the rain would ever end, of ration tins that tasted like river water, of bin guns so clogged with dirt that they became useless during firefights. Most haunting of all were the nights. In the darkness, the valley was a black void, fields disappearing into mist. Artillery flashes lighting up silhouettes of fallen men half buried in mud. Canadians slept sitting up, afraid that lying down meant sinking and never waking again. A victory with no triumph. When the valley was finally cleared and the Canadians advanced toward the Hitler line, there was no cheer. They were too tired to celebrate, too soaked to feel relieved, too haunted by the valley that had eaten so much of their strength. The WWII Valley wasn't dramatic like Ortona. It wasn't fiery like Sicily. It wasn't mountainous like the Gothic line. No, the WWII Valley was a test of endurance, a slow, suffocating trial. That proved the Italian campaign wasn't just brutal, it was relentless. By late 1944, the Canadians had fought across Sicily's cliffs, Ortona's ruins, and the drowning fields of the WWII Valley. Each new battlefield felt like the worst one yet until they reached the Gothic line. A defensive system so brutally engineered that even veteran soldiers stopped in silence when they first saw it. Farley Mitt called it a wall built by the devil to keep men out. And that was exactly what it felt like. The Gothic line stretched across the spine of the Anine Mountains. 67 kilometers of ridges, bunkers, tunnels, concrete positions, and interlocking machine gun nests. The Germans had taken a year to prepare it. Nature had taken thousands of years to make it nearly impossible. The Canadians had to crack it open, climbing into the teeth of the Apennines. The approach to the Gothic line was nothing like the wide-open valley of Lirai. Here the land rose sharply. Ridges stacked like walls, slopes so steep that even mules slipped, and forests so dense that sunlight came down in thin spears. Canadian troops had to climb their way into battle. The fights for Monte Carlo Point 204 and Carano Ridge were among the most exhausting assaults the Canadians ever launched. Every German bunker sat on high ground. Every ridge forced the infantry into a narrow, predictable ascent. Every advance felt like pushing into the barrel of a loaded gun. Soldiers climbed with hands and knees, in some places, rifles slung across their backs, fingers digging into rock as dirt rained down from enemy artillery. The Germans waited until the Canadians were halfway up, tired, exposed, gasping for breath, and then they opened fire. Battles fought in darkness and fog. Many assaults on the Gothic line began at night, not because it was safer, but because daylight made the Canadians perfect targets. The nighttime attacks were surreal, shapes flickering through mist, muzzle flashes sparking like fireflies, men slipping on wet rock, shouts disappearing into the wind, tracers ricocheting off stone walls. Mo described one night assault as fighting inside a dream that wanted us dead. Friendly units lost each other in the fog. German paratroopers counterattacked from angles no map had ever shown. Grenades rolled down slopes like iron fruit. For hours, no one knew who held the upper hand. The Germans who would not break. The defenders of the Gothic line were not ordinary troops. They were 1st Parachute Division, veterans of Ortona, 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, mountain units trained for terrain like this. These soldiers fought with fanatic discipline. They withdrew only when forced. They counterattacked as soon as the Canadians dug in. They booby-trapped every fallen bunker. And they always had higher ground. Canadian veterans later said that the German defenses felt alive, as if the mountains themselves were shooting back, breaking the Devil's Wall. Victory didn't come through one decisive battle. It came through days of grinding, wet, miserable, close quarters fighting. Infantry clawed their way up slopes. Tanks dragged uphill by bulldozers fired at bunkers point blank. Engineers crawled forward under machine gun fire to blow gaps in the fortifications. Artillery crews fired until barrels glowed red. When the Gothic line finally cracked open on September 1944, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Cold, shaking, exhausted survival. The Canadians had broken through one of Hitler's strongest defensive systems. But by doing so, they had left pieces of themselves scattered across the mountains. Mo wrote afterward, "We climbed into hell, and we climbed out again, but none of us came back unchanged." The official histories of the Italian campaign list the battles, the victories, the casualties. But what they don't list, what rarely appears in textbooks, are the quiet miseries that hollowed out the men who fought there. The Canadians carried more than rifles up those mountains. They carried exhaustion, hunger, grief, and a loneliness that clung to them like the mud of the Lirai Valley. Farley Mitt wrote little about glory. He wrote about survival, the war that stole sleep. On paper, soldiers were supposed to get rest. In Italy, rest was a myth. Most Canadian infantry went days on end with only 2 to 4 hours of sleep. And often that sleep came curled in a ditch, sitting against a shattered wall inside a collapsed barn on bare rock, still wearing their gear. Night assaults, German counterattacks, artillery harassment, and the simple terror of darkness kept them awake. Many veterans later admitted that they didn't remember entire days, just flashes. War had blurred into a fog of exhaustion. Hunger that never went away. The Italian campaign consumed calories faster than the supply chain could replace them. See, rations arrived moldy, soaked, crushed, or simply missing. Fresh provisions were rare. Water was sometimes contaminated. Men fought while lightheaded, stomachs empty, lips cracked from dehydration. Moet remembered entire platoons marching silently, not because of discipline, but because they lacked the energy to speak. "We were always hungry," he wrote. "Always the invisible wounds." Today we call it PTSD. In 1944 it was simply called battle exhaustion and often ignored. Canadian soldiers in Italy lived through the screams of the wounded echoing across stone streets, nights filled with the rumble of artillery rolling over mountains, the sight of civilians scavenging through ruins for food, the guilt of surviving when friends did not, and the terror of close-range fighting in Ortona's pitch-black rooms. Some men woke at night, convinced German paratroopers were in the next building. Others avoided sleep entirely because they feared the dreams awaiting them. There were no therapists, no decompression, no one to talk to. Their only coping mechanism was silence, the burden they carried home. When the war in Italy ended, the Canadians marched north, then into new battles. But they carried Italy with them, every ruined street, every climb, every friend buried in foreign soil. Moet later said Italy was a heartbreak that never quite healed. It wasn't the grand battles that scarred the most. It was the things left unwritten: the hunger, the fear, the sickness, the nightmares, and the quiet knowledge that no one back home would ever truly understand what they had endured. When the guns finally fell silent in northern Italy, there was no great celebration among the Canadians who had survived the march from Sicily. No victory parade, no triumphant shouts, just a long, quiet exhale. The release of men who had spent nearly 2 years fighting a war the world would later call the Forgotten Front. But the Canadians could never forget it. They remembered the white heat of Sicily, the way the sun swallowed breath and strength. They remembered Ortona's darkness, the city where every doorway hid death and every street echoed with the ghosts of fallen comrades. They remembered the Liri Valley's mud, cold and suffocating, grabbing at their legs like a living thing. They remembered the Gothic line, the Devil's Wall, where the mountains seemed to rip the life out of anyone who climbed them. Farley Moet, years later, tried to explain it. Italy was not a campaign. It was a journey through every form of misery a soldier could endure. The Canadians who returned home carried no medals for the worst nights, no citations for the illnesses they battled, and no memorial for the fear they buried deep inside themselves. The scars were silent. The memories were personal. But the cost was real. Today, visitors walk through peaceful Italian towns, Ortona, Leon, Forte, Coriano, never imagining the blood that once soaked their stones. Mountains that once thundered with artillery now echo only with church bells. Fields once torn apart by mortar fire now grow wheat and olives under the same sun that once tormented young Canadian soldiers. But if you listen closely, history still whispers. It whispers of the men who climbed the impossible, who crawled through darkness, who fought sickness, hunger, and despair, and who never stopped moving forward. They were never meant to be heroes, but Italy made them heroes anyway.